Imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. No hell below us, above us only sky. Imagine all the people living life in peace. Woo-hoo.
Hello, welcome to Conversations with SOTU. I'm Adrienne Metcalf.
And I'm Josh Schwartzbeck.
Josh is a professional medium and he channels the consciousness we call SOTU. Been working with and talking with SOTU for over 20-some years. And today you get to listen in to some of that conversation about life and human beings and where we're all going. So, are you ready?
We're already here.
Hi, SOTU. Let us just say that we are taping this on 9/11/2017, just after a couple of hurricanes have made landfall.
And we are going to continue the conversation that we were speaking of, not to interrupt you.
Gotcha.
But you tend to be a little long-winded now and again, not like us. But we were speaking about the dynamics that were leading up to the 9/11 dynamic, and actually what has led up until this is the 11th day, and Hurricane the Hurricane Irma has just gone through Florida and is now up into Georgia and Alabama and is moving into the south, and so the dynamic still hasn't played out, and yet we would say it is part of that dynamic that began in 1963 with the loss of your innocence. And if you go back to the last show, excuse us, we're not going to re-explain it, but we are going to say that we left you in the dynamics of the last show with the understanding that earthly humanity had just made a huge leap forward in consciousness, where a wave of unconditional love had swept the planet from end to end, basically through the auspices of technology.
And that happened on January 1st, December 31st, January 1st, 2000.
That's correct, with the change of the millennium. And,
right.
and so, again, when something wonderful happens like that, and you have given ambiguous messages in the past, all right, because understand, if you just take it from 1963, you had Kennedy's assassination, you had RFK's assassination, you had Martin Luther King's assassination, you had the beginnings of the the movement into the Vietnam War. Excuse us. You lost your innocence.
Yes.
And that began to move you into a different sort of consciousness, a more me and I sort of consciousness rather than a we consciousness. Instead of a dynamic of ask not what you can do for your country, ask what your country can do for you, it was all about me, me, me.
Well, that ask what the
me,
country
me,
can do
I,
for you.
I.
Yes, yes.
Right, and that's the dynamic that it moved into. Well, you know, again, something beautiful and something big like that happens, you're going to get an are you sure?
And you're talking about when that wave
of unconditional
love, which was the first
time. This is a response, yes, you don't have to reiterate that. This is the first time that occurred, and anytime you make a change and something new happens, and you've given ambiguous messages in the past, and look at the history, your reality has to ask you if you're sure before it gives you that new dynamic. And here's what you were. You were Americans, you were proud, you were feeling connected, you were feeling loving, you were feeling compassionate. And what was the first are you sure that occurred? And don't answer because we know you already know the answer. And many of you will jump to, oh, well, it was 9/11. No, it was not 9/11. It was the selection of George Bush in the year 2000, so that he began his term in 2001. that began to change everything, didn't it?
Yes.
And so then you had the dynamic within the first year, within the first few months of his administration, you have the dynamic of 9/11. Now, the story that is told with 9/11, everything is wrong. There is so much ambiguity. There is so little clarity in that whole dynamic. All we can tell you is the official story is full of, right? Because unless someone can show us how you can suspend the physical laws of reality, the laws of physics, on that day only, and that time only, in that location only, unless you can show us how that happened, it's not to be believed. So we are not here to say what did happen and who was behind it, but we are here to say we did a session in New York City on the 16th.
That year.
That year. And in that session, we asked people, what do you think this is all about? And everybody was saying, it's a wake-up call. Well, no, dear ones, it wasn't a wake-up call. It was an "Are you sure?" A second "Are you sure?" that came after the first one, which was the selection of George Bush, which, if you were true believers in democracy, if you were true believers in the right thing, how could you ever let a Supreme Court and a politically biased Supreme Court to make that selection for you? And so the "Are you sure?" wasn't in the action of the Supreme Court, but was in the action of your acceptance of it.
That. Lack of taking responsibility.
Well, you know, and 9/11 was a prime example of the dynamic. Were you going to act like adults? Were you going to act like an adult? Were you going to act like adults, or were you going to act like enraged, entitled, special children? Because that's what you were acting out of, was the dynamic of entitlement.
Because in a brief period, we had the heart of the world with us. And if we had stopped and said, why did these people do this?
But you were saying that. If you looked at the dynamic, there were millions in the streets. But you were not being patriotic because the United States had just been attacked. Right? You believe that story about 19 hijackers with X-Acto knives? Really? Okay. And the "Are you sure's" have continued since then.
Yes.
Okay, you began this war on terrorism. Oh, what did that do for your karma? You know, and things have been getting worse and worse and more polarized, and you've accepted the Patriot Act, you've accepted the suspension of the Bill of Rights, you've accepted all of this stuff out of fear that the Islamics are going to come and they're going to kill you, they're going to make you do the Sharia law, and you don't have any freedom now. All those things, all those truths you have held to be self-evident, you have thrown out the window. Controversial enough. But the "Are you sure's" haven't stopped. The "Are you sure's" continued. One of the biggest ones was the tsunami. Yes. The great tsunami that when 250,000 of you left at the same time.
And you've said that when a large number of people leave at the same time, they're saying something to the entire species.
Right. And if you look at the dynamic, again, if you look at the dynamic of the bigger picture, you have the rift, the rupture occurred in the midst of the Indian Ocean, what could be considered a dividing line between East and West, and it happened after you began to perpetrate your aggressive dynamic on that quote-unquote Eastern part of the world, and the pressure of the two civilizations pushing against each other at a certain point built up to the point where the dynamic slipped and there was the huge earthquake under the sea and a great tsunami, and 250,000 of you left in an instant. Huge. Huge. And now the latest dynamics, well, it's been awfully quiet. Your weather has been manipulated now for, we think, at least 3 seasons, the hurricane season. And yes, there is weather manipulation. Mm-hmm. You can look it up. You know, there are papers written about it. There are, you know, there's weather manipulation. There's seeding, and, you know, not to say that was the sole cause, but we would say that those are the dynamics that can exacerbate certain situations. And so reality is going to keep pushing you, dear ones. But reality is going to have a dual purpose. Those that caused the disaster or was responsible for aiding and abetting the disaster, at least energetically, and that includes some of you that thinks that it serves them right, that karma got them, that, no, that's not the truth. That is not the truth. The truth of the matter is that your reality is asking you to be more. Your reality is asking you to grow. Your reality is asking you to come together in caring, in compassion, in connection. And it's going to keep pushing. You know, you got Jose off the coast right now. What's going to happen? Could be nothing, or it could be manipulated. Us talking about it takes away from the possibility of the dynamic happening.
So I was curious about that because Hurricane Harvey, the first one that hit Texas, came really quickly. It seemed out of the blue.
Well, actually, the tropical storm Harvey had existed for a great deal of time and had dissipated to the point where it was merely a low pressure area.
And we had the eclipse.
You had the eclipse, which added the dynamic and was a, what shall we say, a large dynamic of movement. But what did it do? It divided the United States from one corner to the other.
It did. It reflected that.
Well, that you must look at those things if you wish to understand reality. Your personal and your collective souls are always attempting to have a more conscious conversation with you. And it does that through the dynamic. If it can't speak to you in any other way, it will speak to you in metaphor and in symbol. And so what would you say are the metaphors and the symbols around hurricanes?
A great deal of emotional energy that is warm, the warm water, warmth, anger, frustration, rage, swirling,
but so much emotion,
turning in on,
so much confusion,
right,
so much emotion, so much chaos. Are not hurricanes a representation of what each of you are feeling in your own way?
And the north.
And if you're not feeling it, you just might be a psychopath.
So you had said because we taped literally during the eclipse, that it was a turning point in terms of we'd reached.
Sure, but just as there is the positive possibilities, there's also the negative possibilities. If you continue to allow your reality, allow it, even though it keeps taking more and more and more away from you, if you continue to allow that, then that dynamic will continue until you are forced to act. And it's up to you, dear ones.
So if if I'm in the audience and hearing that, I say, what do I do? And
You
it's
begin to speak truth. You begin to realize that you do not know everything. You begin to realize that you are being lied to on a daily basis. That there are those with hidden agendas that are precipitating certain memes that so many of you believe without question. And so the biggest thing that we think that you each can do in order to begin to affect change is to begin to ask questions. Begin to ask the hard questions. Now, there's no way you're going to be able to out-bully the bully. All right? And so we're not talking about going to war against them, but we are talking about refusing to comply. The most powerful energy that you have, the most powerful tool that each of you has, is to just basically ignore it. Used to be called shunning.
But it requires knowing that it's there, and
well, it requires
sort of
the responsibility of being in the process of assessment.
Right.
You know, assessment is a lot more work than having judgments.
Yes.
Right? Judgments freeze things into place. You don't have to continue to question something because you've already made the judgment. Well, but what is the one thing that's constant in your world?
Change.
Change, exactly right. And so if change is the one thing that is constant in your world, don't you need to constantly be able to, as you learn more, upgrade your dynamic of assessment?
Yes, so
as we begin to teach you the dynamics of this sort of work, we begin with very simplistic and very basic understandings and build upon them and build upon them and build upon them, and we have with you and many others over the years, and built upon them so that the levels of understanding available become greater and greater and greater, and the depth of your wisdom becomes greater and greater and greater. And so the dynamic of knowing, while it may begin with a small k, eventually winds up with a big K, all capital letters.
all right. So from our adolescence, moving into adulthood means being willing to take that responsibility of assessing as
First,
opposed
it's
to
remembering
judging.
that you actually do have the empowerment. You do have the power. And the second is learning how to use it with a certain dynamic. Because once you are creating from the entirety of your being, you're going to be who you wish to be. You're going to create the world that you wish to create.
So even though what you're talking about might entail initially more responsibility, but the results in terms of creating a better life for oneself, creating a better life for...
I think it's breaking, it's not that so much, it's breaking the old habits. It's breaking those old ways of being and doing that have kept you locked into these patterns, that have kept you giving your power to the government, giving your power to your husband or your wife, giving your power to anybody, not taking responsibility, blaming anything and everyone for everything. It is never your fault.
Been there.
Well, there's so many of you that are there in this world right now.
Right. And it will never bring about solutions. It'll never bring
all it will
peace.
bring up is more conflict and more and louder and more severe are you sure's. Because if it takes, we hate to say this to you, but we will because it is a dynamic of truth. If it takes your soul wiping most of you off of the planet in order to achieve this dynamic, that's what will happen.
Sobering.
Look what's going on in your world. And if you throw in the dynamic of the earthquake and the other hurricane that hit Mexico,
And the fires in the West.
And the fires in the West. And from our perspectives, there are no coincidences. So, there you have it.
Questioning our beliefs, being willing to take that responsibility of that flexibility and that level of awareness that doesn't just rest on old judgments, and have compassion for ourselves and the change we're going through.
Yes, yes. And so many of you are invested in the status quo. So many of you have invested the time and the energy and have done and have been successful within the rules and all of that stuff. And yet, you are the ones that are going to suffer the most when the rug is pulled out from under you. And right now, you're only on a very little bit of that rug right now. So, by this time next year, we would suggest to you that so much will have changed unless and until you are willing to stand up, even within the dynamics of your own family, and say, no, that is not the truth. That is not the truth that I know. And begin to, instead of be that live and let live person, to begin to stand up for your rights to live and let live. Because those out there in your world that would control you would have you stay in that passive position forever. So it's up to you, dear ones. You as individuals, you as an entire species. Begin to make those small moves within your life. Begin to have those understandings. There is going to be many challenges that you are going to be faced with over the next 6 months. Will you respond as adults? Or will you fall back into your child self? Or fall back into your adolescent self? That child self that just wants mommy or daddy to love me, maybe just this one time. Mm-hmm. Or that adult self who says, I will take charge of this in my own life. I will not do this because it's not moral.
And the adolescent self?
The adolescent self is full of rage. Mm-hmm. And you will see that begin to reflect if there is a dynamic of war, if they're going to blame someone, like your president, for the financial collapse that is imminent. We don't know how someone who has only been in office 6 or 7 months can affect the whole dynamic of the economy, but they're going to try to lay it on them. And we're not Republican either. We're neither Republican nor Democrat, and we can find great fault in both ends of that paradox.
Well, this is just such a sunny future.
Well, 9/11 is such a sunny day. You need to begin to question it. You need to begin to raise your voices and say, I want to know the truth.
Right.
And your reality is going to keep slapping you up the side of the head with a baseball bat until you do. And we hate to put it that frankly, but that's the way it is.
Have compassion, question, take responsibility.
That's exactly right. And realize that you create your reality through your thoughts, your words, and your feelings. So it's time to reconsider. And it's time to take responsibility for errant thoughts. And it's time to take responsibility for frivolous words. And the dynamics of feelings, well, that can be mastered also. It just takes a little longer. All right, dear ones. On that note, We love you all so very, very much, and we'll be back with better news next week. And so until then, we close, sending you peace, sending you happiness, sending you joy.
Thank you for joining us for Conversations with SOTU. If you have questions or if you'd like to join us for a live presentation with SOTU, please go to our website, conversationswithsotu.org. We do have a monthly live opportunity for you to speak directly with SOTU with your questions, unfiltered, unrecorded, either in person here in the Berkshires of Western Massachusetts or through Skype. And we'd love to have your participation. And also our sister or brother site, the peacegenesisproject.org, has some hopeful clues to what peace and our future as humanity could be like. So again, thank you especially for sitting in on this one. Time for peace.
You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us, and the